Moses, a prominent figure in religious and historical narratives, is renowned for his pivotal role in the biblical accounts of the Hebrew people's liberation from slavery in ancient Egypt. His journey, chronicled in the book of Exodus, has captivated the imagination of countless individuals throughout history. While many are familiar with the basic narrative of Moses leading the Israelites through the parted waters of the Red Sea and receiving the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, there are several lesser-known facets of his life that provide a deeper understanding of this extraordinary figure. Firstly, Moses asked God to remove his name from the Book of Life. Why did he make such a request, and what can we learn from it? This happened when the people worshipped a golden calf, showing how humans can stray from their commitment to God. It's ironic that while Moses was receiving the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, the Israelites broke the first commandment by worshiping another god. They became impatient while waiting for Moses and decided to make their own deity. They melted their gold and made a golden calf. They asked Aaron, Moses' brother, to be their spiritual leader in Moses' absence. Aaron agreed and made the golden calf even though it was forbidden. Then they had wild celebrations, worshiping the idol and engaging in excessive eating, drinking, and partying. God told Moses to come down from the mountain because the people he led out of Egypt had gone astray. They quickly abandoned God's instructions, made and worshipped the golden calf, and claimed it was their savior from Egypt. Exodus 32:7-8. When Moses came down with Joshua, he confronted the people during their sinful and idolatrous festivities. In his anger, he smashed the stone tablets that represented the law, showing his disapproval of their actions. Exodus 32:31-34. Moses then approached God and admitted that the people had committed a grave sin by making golden idols. He asked for forgiveness for the people, or, if not possible, requested that God remove his own name from the divine records. God said those who sinned would be removed from his book and told Moses to continue leading the people, promising punishment at the right time. Despite the seriousness of their sin, Moses didn't try to downplay their actions, but instead asked for God's mercy and compassion. Moses asked God to forgive the people of Israel and even offered to be punished in their place if forgiveness was not granted. He believed that the people's sin was so serious that an animal sacrifice would not be enough, and only a human sacrifice could bear their sins. Moses was willing to have his name removed from God's records if it could somehow save the people. God did not accept Moses' plea, but this moment foreshadowed the future sacrifice of Jesus, who would provide complete atonement for humanity's sins. Although God chose to spare the nation, he still had the authority to judge individuals for their sins. He instructed Moses to continue leading the people to their destination, promising to be faithful to Israel and to accompany them with his presence and his angel leading the way. Another story involving Moses is found in the books of Kings. It mentions an image called the idol of Nehushtan, which was a bronze serpent wrapped around a pole. After the Israelites were freed from Egypt, they complained about their living conditions, and as a punishment, God sent fiery serpents among them, causing many deaths. In response to Moses' prayers, God instructed him to make a bronze serpent and put it on a pole. God promised that anyone who looked at the serpent would be healed from their snake bite. Over time, the Israelites started to worship this bronze serpent. The worship of Nehushtan continued until the time of King Hezekiah's reforms, when he destroyed pagan worship sites, sacred stones, Asherah poles, and the bronze serpent made by Moses. The Israelites had been burning incense to it and calling it Nehushtan, which simply meant a piece of bronze. This story shows how objects associated with divine miracles can become idols, even though it goes against God's commandments. The bronze serpent was initially a way for God to deliver the people from the crisis described in Numbers 21, with no intention for it to be worshipped afterwards. Hezekiah might have named it Nehushtan to emphasize that it was just a piece of bronze with no special power. In the story from Numbers 21, it was God who healed the people, not the object Nehushtan. This reminds us that even good things and respected individuals can become objects of worship. We should only worship, praise, and be grateful to God, as nothing else, no matter how important it may seem, deserves our devotion. Another important story is about Moses and the burning bush incident, which teaches us about obedience. God chose Moses to rescue the Israelites from Egypt and lead them to the promised land of Canaan. Moses was called to be a leader at the burning bush, a significant moment in his life. God promised him that he would save his people and give them a new land. After spending 40 years in Midian, Moses, along with his wife Zipporah and their sons Gershom and Eleazar, returned to Egypt as instructed by God. However, before Moses could fulfill his role as a deliverer, he needed to follow God's commands himself. He forgot to circumcise one of his sons, either Gershom or Eleazar, possibly because Zipporah was against it. Exodus 4:24-26. This mistake led to a dangerous situation during their journey when God tried to kill Moses. Zipporah intervened by circumcising their son herself, throwing the foreskin at Moses' feet, and calling him a bridegroom of blood, which saved his life. The text doesn't explicitly mention Moses' error in Exodus 4:24-26, but the context suggests that he had neglected the important practice of circumcision, possibly influenced by his Midianite family's dislike of it. Zipporah's actions and her response indicate that she believed performing the covenant ritual prevented her husband from facing God's anger. So Moses initially failed to follow God's command. God made it clear to Moses that he doesn't choose just anyone. He chooses those who are holy and blameless. We understand that we are not naturally holy and blameless, and it is only through Christ that we are justified. However, this doesn't mean we can keep sinning, assuming that grace will keep increasing. Moses was getting ready to go back and represent God, but he had failed to meet the righteous standards expected of such a position, even within his own family. So God planned to end Moses' life. God's judgments are strong because he wants to show that he is not a deity to be taken lightly. As the chosen deliverer, Moses needed to fix parts of his behavior that were not aligned with God's holiness. This standard of judgment also applied to the Israelites, showing that God doesn't use corrupted people to judge others. Moses was considered unfit to be a spiritual leader because of his unresolved sins, which needed to be addressed before he could properly fulfill his duties. Once Zipporah performed the necessary act, God spared Moses. In essence, God was willing to end Moses' life because he was teaching, but also breaking God's law. Now, let's talk about the fourth point. Moses was not allowed to enter the promised land, and at first, it may seem like the punishment was too severe compared to his offense. When Moses struck a rock in frustration with the Israelites in the wilderness, it might appear like a minor mistake to justify such a strong consequence, especially considering his past achievements like leading Israel out of Egypt and delivering the 10 Commandments. However, the incident at Meribah, where Moses struck the rock, resulted in him being prohibited from entering the land God had promised to Israel. The Israelites had complained about the lack of water and tested the Lord, causing Moses to seek God's guidance. God told Moses to gather the elders, take his staff, and strike the rock at Horeb to bring forth water for the people. Moses followed these instructions, and water flowed from the rock. Exodus 17:4-6. Now let's look at the second incident at Meribah, where Moses acted out of frustration and disobeyed God. Numbers 20. When the Israelites faced another water crisis in the desert of Zin near Kadesh and complained to Moses, it resembled the previous situation. However, Moses responded differently this time and didn't follow God's specific instructions, leading to significant consequences. In the 40th year after leaving Egypt, the Israelites were staying in Kadesh. It was there that Miriam died and was buried. During that time, they faced a shortage of water, which made the congregation frustrated with Moses and Aaron. The people regretted not dying along with others in earlier tragedies, and questioned why Moses had led them to a barren wilderness to die, along with their animals. They criticized the decision to leave Egypt for a land that lacked basic necessities like food and water. In response, Moses and Aaron went to the entrance of the tent of meeting and prayed to God. God's glory appeared to them, and he instructed Moses to gather the congregation and speak to a rock in front of them, making it produce water for everyone and their animals. Moses took the staff as commanded and gathered the people in front of the rock. However, instead of speaking to the rock, Moses expressed frustration and struck it twice with his staff. Water gushed out, providing for the congregation and their animals. Despite the miracle, God rebuked Moses and Aaron for their lack of faith and for not upholding his holiness in front of the Israelite children. As a consequence, God decreed that neither of them would lead the congregation into the Promised Land. This event became known as the Waters of Meribah, where the Israelites argued with the Lord, but he showed his glory among them. Although Moses had been faithful in following God's instructions in the past, this incident revealed a significant mistake. At first, it may seem like God's punishment of Moses was harsh, considering his long-standing faithfulness. However, understanding the symbolism is important. The first striking of the rock represents Christ, as mentioned in 1 Corinthians 10:1-5, which talks about the Israelites drinking from a spiritual rock that represented Christ. In this context, Moses' actions in Numbers 20, striking the rock twice instead of speaking to it as commanded, carried deep theological implications, explaining why God couldn't overlook this error. In Exodus 17, God told Moses to strike a rock, which symbolized Christ as our Savior. Christ is compared to a rock in other parts of the Bible, like Psalms and Isaiah, and his sacrifice is portrayed as bringing forth living waters. The book of Hebrews also emphasizes that Christ's death was enough to save us, so there's no need for more sacrifices. Therefore, when God asked Moses to strike the rock in Exodus 17, it represented Jesus' sacrifice for our salvation. Later, in Numbers 20, God instructed Moses to speak to the rock, keeping the same symbolism from Exodus 17. However, Moses chose to strike the rock again, which changed the intended message and could have confused people, suggesting that Christ needed to be sacrificed repeatedly. God corrected Moses by not allowing him to enter the Promised Land to clarify this theological point. It showed that salvation, represented by entering the Promised Land, is not achieved by following the law alone, represented by Moses, but through faith in Jesus' work, represented by Joshua, whose name means Jesus in Hebrew. When Moses struck the rock in anger instead of speaking to it as God commanded, it resulted in him not being able to enter the Promised Land. It highlighted the importance of obeying God's instructions rather than letting our emotions guide us. The fifth point discusses the magicians Moses encountered, Jannes and Jambres, mentioned in the story of Pharaoh's court in Exodus 7 and 8. When Moses and Aaron asked Pharaoh to release the Israelites, they performed miracles to show God's power. Moses was a unique figure in history, known for the many miracles attributed to him. These acts demonstrated his authority and marked him as an unparalleled prophet in Israel. Before Jesus Christ, there were many important and respected leaders, rulers, prophets, and priests in Israel. However, none of them held all these roles with as much distinction as Moses. Despite performing incredible miracles, Moses faced opposition from the magicians Jannes and Jambres. When Moses and Aaron first met Pharaoh, God told them to make a convincing demonstration of their authority. Aaron was instructed to throw his staff on the ground, knowing that Pharaoh would ask for a sign. As Aaron did this, his staff turned into a serpent. The magicians in Pharaoh's court used their own enchantments to replicate this transformation with their staffs. However, Aaron's serpent swallowed the serpents of the magicians, serving as a powerful sign to Pharaoh. According to Exodus 7:8-13, God told Moses and Aaron what to do if Pharaoh demanded further miraculous proof. They were to tell Aaron to throw his staff on the ground, and it would become a serpent. Aaron followed these instructions and performed the act in front of Pharaoh and his officials, successfully turning his staff into a serpent. Pharaoh then called his wise men and sorcerers, who were skilled in magic and divination. They imitated this feat using their own magical practices, turning their staffs into serpents as well. However, Aaron's serpent ultimately consumed theirs. Despite witnessing this, Pharaoh remained stubborn, just as the Lord had predicted. Pharaoh's magicians were able to replicate some of the signs performed by Moses and Aaron a few more times. For example, when Moses brought the first plague upon Egypt, turning the water into blood, the magicians also turned water into blood, imitating Moses' act with the Nile River. This is described in Exodus 7:19-22. During this plague, God instructed Moses to tell Aaron to stretch out his hand with the staff over the waters of Egypt, including the rivers, canals, ponds, and reservoirs, turning them all into blood. As commanded, Moses and Aaron struck the water of the Nile, causing all the water in Egypt to turn into blood. This resulted in the death of fish and made the water undrinkable due to the foul odor, affecting the entire land of Egypt. However, the magicians in Egypt responded to each plague using their magical practices, which only made Pharaoh more stubborn, just as God had predicted. This was a serious mistake on the part of the magicians. Instead of trying to lessen the impact of the plagues, they made them worse. For example, when the water turned into blood, they also turned more water into blood, making the situation even worse for their own people. This shows that their dark arts were destructive and focused on showing their power rather than helping the people they were supposed to serve. Their misguided approach did nothing to relieve the suffering of the Egyptians. During the second plague, when frogs swarmed the land, the magicians made things worse by summoning even more frogs. They didn't provide any relief. Eventually, the magicians could no longer replicate the plagues and admitted to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God," Exodus 8:19, recognizing that these occurrences were of divine origin. However, Pharaoh still refused to change his mind, just as God had predicted. The fact that Pharaoh's magicians could imitate some of the miracles performed by Moses and Aaron raises questions about where their power came from. Although much weaker than God, Satan, who was once a high-ranking angel, can still deceive, imitate miracles, and predict events to some extent. But in the end, God's power prevailed. When the sorcerers failed to produce lice, it clearly showed that God's strength was far greater than Satan's schemes. The activities of these magicians, who drew power from dark forces, and their acceptance as genuine, serve as a warning about the deception that can occur in the end times. Just as Jannes and Jambres had their limits, Satan's power is also limited, even in the latter days. However, God is still in control and offers the hopeful assurance of victory through Jesus. Miracles might indicate supernatural intervention, but they don't necessarily prove the truth. The Egyptian magicians were undoubtedly intelligent and knowledgeable, but their abilities were no match for the divine power of God. Paul observed that despite their abilities, these individuals lacked the divine wisdom that only comes from God. Many of us are fascinated by any display of spiritual power, often failing to question whether its source is sinister rather than divine. Even when a new power seems to offer the answers we're looking for, we must be cautious and not be lured by it, as evil entities can pretend to be good. The sixth point to consider is that Moses is the only person whom God personally buried. The Bible doesn't provide many details about Moses' death. He went up from the plains of Moab to the top of Mount Nebo, specifically to the summit of Pisgah, which overlooks Jericho. From there, God allowed him to see the entire land, from Gilead to Dan, covering Naphtali, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Judah, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, the Valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, and up to Zoar. Moses is remembered with honor as God's servant, a role he fulfilled by faithfully following God's commands, just as a servant obeys the instructions of their master. His devotion to God was evident in his deep respect for God's name, his unwavering loyalty to God's cause, and his strong belief in God's word. However, even as a dedicated servant, Moses had to face death. While most people die, only 2 individuals in the Bible bypassed death and entered directly into glory, but Moses was not one of them. At the end of his life, God allowed Moses to see the Promised Land from Mount Nebo, a view that he had left Egypt for. This mountain symbolizes a passage that all of us will eventually face when we join our ancestors. We should aspire to face this transition with the same readiness as Moses, the servant of God. The circumstances of his death were extraordinary, happening at the impressive height of approximately 1,370 meters on Mount Pisgah, nearly a mile high. It's rare to find a 120-year-old man who can climb a mountain almost a mile high and live to tell the tale. But Moses did exactly that. He was able to climb the mountain without needing a wide path, showing that he was in remarkably good physical shape. Even at his age, Moses energetically reached the top of a 1,370-meter peak and enjoyed the view from there. Moses, a man chosen by God, stood alone at the summit of the mountain, looking out at the Promised Land. His upcoming death wasn't a surprise. It had been predicted, and Moses had known for a long time that he wouldn't enter Canaan. He was prepared for his departure and accepted it as the fulfillment of his divine mission. Instead of complaining or resisting, Moses embraced his fate. His death marked the culmination of his life's work, successfully leading his people through the wilderness. What's more, Moses died in the best company possible, with God himself. While many people have their loved ones around them in their final moments, Moses didn't have any direct family to close his eyes. Instead, he left this world exactly as God had planned. Moses lived a full 120 years without needing glasses or walking aids, never becoming dependent on a rocking chair or special supplements. However, Deuteronomy 34:6 reveals something extraordinary about his life. It says that God personally buried Moses in a place unknown to anyone. This secrecy was intentional because if the location of his burial had been known, it might have become a place of pilgrimage, attracting commercial exploitation and idolatrous worship. So it was important for the Lord to keep his grave hidden, even leading to a dispute among angels. This confrontation involved the archangel Michael arguing with the devil over Moses' body, a unique event mentioned in the book of Jude. Jude reveals this remarkable incident that isn't recorded anywhere else in the Bible. Michael, instead of making harsh accusations, relied on a rebuke from the Lord to oppose Satan. This episode highlights the significance and sacredness of Moses' final resting place. The question naturally arises about where Jude's account of the dispute between Archangel Michael and Satan over Moses' body comes from. Some suggest that this information was passed down through tradition, but there isn't enough evidence to confirm this theory. The reasons behind the dispute are unclear, but it's possible that Satan wanted to find Moses' body to create a shrine. However, Michael, following God's command, responded with the Lord's rebuke instead of passing judgment himself. Despite his great power, Michael shows complete respect for God. This act shows that true submission doesn't diminish one's strength, purpose, or worth. Michael's submission, especially considering his status and power, highlights a beautiful aspect of angelic hierarchy and obedience. Archangel Michael is mentioned again in Revelation 12:7 during a significant scene where Satan is thrown out of heaven. This confrontation, although often unwelcome, is considered necessary for correction, purification, and unity within the community. The ninth important point involves Moses' encounter with Jesus during the Transfiguration, a crucial event described in all the Gospels. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John to a high mountain where he undergoes a miraculous transformation. His face shines like the sun, and his clothes become dazzling white. Matthew 17:2. This event signifies not only Jesus' divine nature, but also the fulfillment of God's kingdom on earth. During the Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah appear alongside Jesus. They represent the law and the prophets, respectively, bearing witness to Jesus as the Messiah who fulfills the Old Testament. Moses, respected as a great leader and lawgiver, and Elijah seen as a connection between the earlier non-literary prophets and the later written prophets, together emphasize Jesus' superiority. The presence of Moses and Elijah highlights Jesus' majestic role as the Son of God, surpassing them both. Their appearance with Jesus on the mountain emphasizes his position as the ultimate prophet, fulfilling what Moses had prophesied. Furthermore, Jesus' fulfillment of both the law and the prophets symbolizes his divine mission, which Moses and Elijah's revelations pointed to. When the disciples see only Jesus, their focus shifts completely to him, aligning with the roles of Moses and Elijah in announcing the coming of the Messiah. This significant moment on the mountain shows that all previous revelations were meant to prepare the way for Jesus, confirming his identity as the Son of God and his redemptive mission. Even though the disciples had a clear revelation about who Jesus was, they still struggled to fully understand the significance of what they had witnessed. In the 10th part of the story, we learn about Moses' powerful encounters with God. Moses first met God through a burning bush, saw God's power over Pharaoh and the Egyptians, witnessed the splitting of the sea, and received water from a rock. He also spent 40 days and nights on Mount Sinai in the presence of God. After experiencing these incredible miracles, Moses desired a deeper and more personal connection with God. He valued this relationship above all the miraculous acts and gifts from God, understanding that truly knowing God is the greatest blessing a person can have. This is also mentioned in John 17:3, where eternal life is defined as knowing the one true God and Jesus Christ, whom he sent. In response to Moses' desire to know who would accompany him, God assured him by saying, "My presence will go with you." This confirmed the close relationship and favor that Moses had with the Lord. Moses had a close relationship with God, but he still desired even deeper intimacy and understanding. Despite witnessing incredible miracles like the burning bush, the parting of the Red Sea, and the provision of water and manna, these wonders had become familiar to him. He longed to go beyond the surface and truly understand the nature of God. This led him to ask the Lord, "Please show me your ways, that I may know you." It was like a hungry person who is not satisfied with appetizers, but craves the full banquet of what God could reveal. Moses expressed a deep spiritual longing, comparing it to a deer thirsting for water. God desires this kind of heartfelt pursuit from those who genuinely want to know him, rather than mere attendance from those casually involved with religion. Moses went further in his longing and requested, "Now show me your glory." He didn't just want to know about God, he wanted to witness a visible display of God's divine nature. Moses desired to see the glory of the invisible God made manifest, a tangible demonstration of his presence. He questioned whether it was enough to listen to sermons and sing hymns, or if a deeper, continuous yearning to experience more of God's glory was necessary. Encouraged by his insatiable desire, Moses boldly asked, "Show me your glory." In response, God agreed to renew his covenant with Israel, showing mercy and compassion. He explained how he would reveal his glory to Moses in a way that would preserve Moses' life. God made it clear that while Moses could see his back, his face could not be seen, as seeing God's face would result in death. This arrangement is detailed in Exodus 33:19-23, where God promised to pass by Moses while he stood in a cleft of the rock, covered by God's hand until he had passed. This extraordinary encounter demonstrated God's willingness to meet the deep longings of those who sincerely seek him. To protect Moses, the Lord limited how much of his glory Moses could see. Moses could only catch a brief glimpse of God from behind. He couldn't see the fullness of God's glory. Even with this limited view, the experience was so powerful that Moses' face shone brightly as a result of being in God's presence. This showed the sacredness of his encounter with the Lord. It's important to understand that God is a spirit and doesn't have a physical body with a back or an arm in a literal sense. No one has seen God in his complete glory. However, Jesus, the Son of God, has revealed him to us. As Jesus told his disciples, If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. John 14:9. Until we see God face to face, we continue to live by faith. If you found this discussion helpful, I encourage you to support our content by subscribing. This way, you won't miss any future videos, and we can continue to deepen our collective understanding. Thank you for joining us, and may God bless you.